questions that you have into the chat. I also want to let everyone know that we are recording this session and we will make it available on our YouTube channel for you to refer back to whenever you want. I'm joined today by our experts, Paul Rader and Dave Bodwin. Paul has been working at Ballotpedia since January 2018, first as an intern and then as an assistant staff writer. He also works with the Safety Review, a nonpartisan news aggregator of Florida politics. He received his bachelor's degree in political science at the University of South Florida and has his master's degree in political science from the University of Florida. Dave Bodwin is our news editor and joined Ballotpedia in February 2017. Dave has a BS in accounting from the University of Delaware and an MBA in finance from Temple University. He is also the founder and writer of the blog Local and Special Elections, which analyzed local, special, and runoff elections nationwide. Now I will go ahead and turn it over to them.
All righty, thanks, Sarah. Hey, everybody, thank you for coming on or coming into the call. I know this is some crazy times we're living in, but it's always great to see people super interested in this kind of stuff. So just like Sarah said, we're going to be talking a bit about the differences between state and federal government. State governments really don't get a whole lot of coverage in the news, or at least they're getting decreasing coverage. So a lot of people may not know exactly how they work. There are some commonalities. We'll talk a little bit about them. And we're just focused on basic governance here, so like how they actually function, because then you can go into stuff like campaign finance and stuff, and that's starting to get a little too bloated. So we're just going to focus on governance specifically, Dave and I. And just to reiterate, don't feel scared to ask any questions. I know sometimes when there's a lot of people, it can feel a bit scary to ask questions, but if anything's if you have a question about anything, we'll try to answer them as many as we possibly can. And so without further ado, let's get started.
All right, Paul, it's awesome to be here, and it's awesome to talk about the differences in government structure between the federal government and the states. I know with a lot of the attention in the current situation involving coronavirus, there's a lot more spotlight on the governors of various states. So hopefully this is a topic that's going to become more and more interesting and become more and more relevant as we go forward. So why don't we just kind of get started and talk about the fact that, both on the state level and on the federal level, we're generally looking at three branches of government. Is that right?
Indeed. So you have the executive, just like with president, you have governors, you have, similar to cabinets, you have other state executives like attorney generals or attorneys general, lieutenant governors, and sometimes it differs from state to state, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Yeah, but the executive branch is the one that executes or enforces the laws. You have the legislative, so just like with Congress, you have state legislatures. They're all bicameral with one exception, and we'll get into that one later as well. But they create the laws, they write the laws, laws originate with them. And then you have the judicial branch, which is the courts, the ones who actually interpret the laws and say what they mean.
Yeah, so the structure for both the state and federal government follows that rough framework in terms of those three branches. Now, let's just you touched on it a little bit, but let's just go into a little bit more. So how is the executive branch set up in both cases, both state and federal?
Sure. So you have one singular head of state, executive, in the executive branch, sort of like how you have president, you have governor. But we also talked about how there's other offices as well. It's generally speaking, it's the same kind of idea, but whereas you have 15 U.S. cabinet members, 15 secretaries of their respective departments, you usually have less than that for state governments, but it all just depends on which one you go to. There are some things such as auditors or controllers or treasurers or secretaries of state that are not always in certain states. Only governors and attorneys general you'll find in every single state. but just like that, you have like the Department of the Interior, Secretary of the Interior, those sorts of things. Those are who all enforce the laws. It's the same concept.
Yeah, an interesting thing is that we think of the Secretary of State at the federal level handles, I guess, our relationship with other countries, the United States relationship with other countries. But at the state level, the Secretary of State is primarily involved with things like business registrations, election administration, those kind of things. So that's always a tricky one between the state and federal government. All right, so then switching over to the legislative side, at the federal level, we have Congress, we have Senate, the House of Representatives, and that system is pretty much the same at the state level too, correct?
Right. So you have what's called a bicameral legislature, where it's two chambers. You always hear about the U.S. House versus the U.S. Senate. The idea behind that, when the founding fathers originally created it, was the legislative branch was naturally the most powerful because they write the laws. So if you separate it to two chambers, there's a little bit more, I guess, accountability, you could say. It's a whole concept of separation of powers, checks and balances. There is one exception, that's Nebraska, and we'll talk about that later as well. But in all the other states, you're going to see a state house and a state senate.
And then also structure on the judicial level is also similar. We have a U.S. Supreme Court and a federal court structure, and then we have a similar type of thing for the states as well, correct?
Right. So just like there's a U.S. Supreme Court, there's a state Supreme Court. There's actually a couple states that have two Supreme Courts. We'll delve into those a little bit later as well. But there are some key differences in how they all are structured. But generally speaking, you have the Supreme Court, you have appellate courts, you have trial courts underneath them, and it goes on down from there.
Okay. Now, looking back over to the legislative branch, both Congress and state legislatures have committees that kind of facilitate their work.
Right. So the reason they have committees is because there's so many different policy topics that you have. You have, for example, obviously appropriations, which can sometimes be broken down into appropriations for specific things, transportation, health and human services, that sort of thing. Break them up into committees because the idea is you'd have people that are focused on one specific topic, and then bills regarding that topic originate from that committee. So anything regarding any spending is from the Appropriations Committee. Rules for how a chamber, for the U.S. House to operate or a state house to operate, you'll have a Rules Committee, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so basically you have these smaller subgroups that work on legislation on a more detailed level. People are much more familiar with it. And then from there, it gets voted on by the larger bodies. And that structure is consistent between the states and the federal level. And actually, one other similarity is how legislation becomes law, both at the federal and the state level. Paul, can you just kind of get into that a little bit in terms of how an idea becomes legislation?
Sure. So, excuse me, like we just said, that we have committees that where the bills originate from. Sometimes if it's a big enough committee, you might have a subcommittee, like Dave had just talked about. So the idea is it comes from the committee. If the committee signs off on the bill, then it goes to the full chamber, and if that chamber signs off on it, a companion bill from the other chamber. So if the U.S. House signs off on it, then the U.S. Senate has to come up with something similar. And if they pass their own law, they have to hammer out all the differences because they have to be exactly the same bill for it to pass. So even if they sign off on both of their own versions, they have to work out the differences for legal purposes so that they all say the exact same thing.
Awesome. And I saw there was a question, or somebody wanted to ask a question. Is there any chance you could just kind of type that in the chat, and we will get back to that?
Want it typed?
Yeah. Yep, if you could.
Okay. All right.
All right. While you're typing that in there, we'll come back to that. But let's talk a little bit about why there's differences, Paul, between the state and the federal government.
Sure. So, we'll go touch briefly on the very beginning of our Constitution. So, just to touch quickly on the Constitutional Convention, it was ostensibly we originally had what was called the Articles of Confederation that gave states power, and they all handled their own business, but there was a very weak federal government. Eventually, the Constitutional Convention was created ostensibly to amend the Articles, but eventually they just scrapped it completely and came up with a brand new Constitution. So the idea was, how do you balance the state and federal government's power? Obviously, coming away from the British, there was a wariness of federal power because of various grievances, but also there were a lot of failures of the Articles of Confederation because states were far too disunified, and there were sectional and regional interests that just surpassed a national identity. So there were different. It wasn't. Some people did actually support the Articles of Confederation. It was by no means a unanimous support for a new constitution, but from that, there's been different conceptions of how the federal and state governments should divvy up power.
Yeah, it's interesting that part. Let's get back to some of these questions real quick, just so we don't get too far back away from that. So, just to kind of sum up Peter's question here, the power that governors have can really vary from state to state, right? I mean, there's some places where, based on the way the state constitutions are written, they have a lot of power, and in other places they don't. Is that true?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, there's a wide disparity between the powers and the authority that different governors might have from among the 50 states. Isn't that right?
Oh, sorry. Yes, exactly. A lot of it is just this, or it's all based on state statutes and state constitutions. Like we said, states have given some powers to determine what powers their specific offices should have. So some governors may have more power in, say, removing local officials while others don't. There's with the coronavirus situation, there's controversy about whether they should be able to extend stay-at-home orders, that sort of thing. Depending on the state, each one of them has different conceptions of what governors can do.
Gotcha. And then there was another question. Can you, Paul, just kind of reiterate that the fact, I guess, that when a bill is passed in a House, whether it's both on the federal or state level, between the House and the Senate, it has to be the exact same language between both. Is that correct? And what happens if it doesn't?
Right. So, excuse me. The House and the Senate have to have their own versions of the same exact bill, right? So if they're trying to, I don't know, some specific new healthcare law, I can't really think of a specific example off the top of my head, but they both have to go through their process of coming up with the same language. So you start with a House or Senate committee. They come up with their conceptions of the bill. If that committee passes that, then the full chamber, whether it's the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate or the State House or the State Senate, they both have to have their whole chamber vote on it. And then if they both succeed, then House and Senate have to work together to iron out all the kinks. Because of legal reasons, there has to be specific. They have to have specifically what the bill intends to do. You can't have, even if it's just one letter difference, it has to be the same exact thing. So when they finally iron out the differences, that's when and then they vote on that. They have to come back to vote on that to make sure that everybody supports that. Then, excuse me, then if they both vote on it, then it becomes law.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. All right. So getting back to where the differences between the state and federal powers originated, the 10th Amendment is really key here, isn't it? The 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. So the 10th Amendment is, to paraphrase, any powers that are not specifically expressed in the Constitution, states get those powers. So something like state police protection, for example. You don't really have a national version of it. FBI and CIA have some similar responsibilities, but they're not actually a police force. And fire protection as well, that sort of thing. So the 10th Amendment is just a blanket statement to say that states have their own spheres if the U.S. Constitution does not address that. And so that's partly why the federal Constitution is so vague and flexible. Obviously not to a point where you just let it say whatever you want it to say, but it has to be able to go with the times, right? So 230, 240 years ago, the Founding Fathers had way different issues that were going on in their day. That they were going on in their day. Then every so often, each new generation deals with their own specific issues of the day. And the federal Constitution is trying to go along with that, but still keeping the essence of what it's trying to do. Whereas state constitutions, because they have so many of these other reserved powers, they're a lot more specific and rigid. They're way longer. If you read them versus reading the U.S. Constitution, you'll see that they're significantly longer.
Got it. And there's a term that I know that I'm hearing a lot more in the news and just people talking about is this concept of federalism. And as you note here, there's really kind of two types of federalism. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So you have dual, where, and I see a couple of questions. I'll get to those in a second. You have the dual, which is state and federal have their own separate spheres of authority. And then you have the cooperative, where state and federal mix together in their spheres of authority. So sometimes you'll see, depending on the crime, the FBI and the CIA might be working with state or local law enforcement on something, but not always. And you see a lot more cooperative federalism these days than you see dual, but the dual does still exist. And real quick, Dave, want to get to the couple of questions that we have here. So, Carla, you're asking about why the national government is called the federal government. It's just kind of just become interchangeable these days. I can see why you're saying that's confusing. You can just call it the national government if you want, but a lot of people just really just kind of use them interchangeably these days. And as for specifying the federal constitution, yes, they do. The state constitutions can't have anything that directly contradicts a federal, the U.S. Constitution. I'm sorry, maybe I didn't make that very clear. The U.S. Constitution still applies to state constitutions, but you have a lot of not expressly stated powers, because there's so many things that governments have to do that those belong to state governments. Yeah, it by no means do they erase or completely go against the U.S. Constitution, because that is the supreme law of the land.
And it's interesting because this is also, if you look at a lot of court cases, both at the state Supreme Court level, adjudicating, between different branches in the state, and also the Supreme Court can get involved sometimes if they think that there's a difference either between states or a conflict between a piece of legislation at the state level and a piece of legislation at the federal level.
Right. And I do want to add, regarding the states and the U.S. Constitution, there is still a ton of debate even today about just how much power states should have versus the federal government, because there is still a lot of flexibility and vagueness. Some people argue for there's some certain implied powers in the Constitution for the federal government, and that's been a debate that's been as old as the country itself since it's been independent. So some people will say that that things that should be under state government are being done by the federal government, and that shouldn't be that way. Some people argue the opposite. It just depends on who you talk to. Obviously, here at Ballotpedia, we don't take one side or the other. We're just here to give the general idea of what the debate is.
And this is definitely areas that are the subject or the topic of a lot of discussions, both academically and also, like I said, practically at the judicial level, or even in the executive and legislative branches as well. All right, do we want to move to start talking about the differences with the executive branch?
Yep, let's go for it.
Okay, so first of all, there is a difference, between who we elect at the federal level and how many people we elect at the federal level and what happens at the state level. Can you talk about that a little bit, Paul?
Yeah, so you see in the U.S. government, the only one in the executive branch we actually elect is the president. All 15 U.S. cabinet members, cabinet secretaries, whether it's Interior, Housing and Urban Development, the Attorney General, those are all appointed by the president. In state governments, however, you pretty much always see more than that being elected, but some states elect very few of their state executives, while others elect all or almost all of them. So, for example, in Alaska, there's something like, I think, 11 or 12 state executives, but they only elect their governor or lieutenant governor. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, you have 10 of your state executives that are elected. Arizona also is another one that has a lot of its state executives that are elected. And again, that's a thing that where state governments have more power to dictate how they do governance. But U.S. cabinet always has way more appointed members than state governments do.
Yeah, I live in New Jersey, and I'm always kind of jealous because of course, I love voting. I work at Ballotpedia, and we only vote on the governor, and it's a joint ticket with the lieutenant governor. So I always look at some of the other states, and they elect, Transportation Commission and Public Service Commission, and it's just more people to vote for. But that gets into another thing. I mean, certain states, also don't they have different offices in their state, either based on some sort of historical, precedent, or just because of the specific needs of that state, whether they're more agricultural oriented or more mining oriented or whatever, have specific elected officers in those states. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's just because every state has their own unique aspects to it, unique necessities for governance. Like I'm in Florida, for example, and we have what's called a chief financial officer, which is sort of like a treasurer, controller, and auditor all rolled into one. And in fact, I think it used to be all three of those offices separately at one time. You'll see some sort of similar offices elsewhere, but they'll usually be specifically a treasurer or a controller or an auditor. New Hampshire, which is sort of close to New Jersey, I suppose, they have what's called an executive council who advises the governor on various issues like spending and transportation. So not every state is going to have a specifically unique state executive, but you do see them sometimes, and they all have their own unique responsibilities.
So, as we've been talking, some states have certain officers that either don't exist in other states or that don't exist at the federal level, or certainly aren't elected there. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit. I mean, the powers and the duties of people in these executive offices can vary from state to state. Normally secretaries of states are involved with election administration at the state level. But sometimes, that person may be first in line if the governor, has to leave office for some reason. So there's a lot of variation, and each state, again, either through historical patterns or the specific needs of that state or some other reason have this existing. And these differences also exist in things like term limits as well. Can you talk about that a little bit, Paul?
Yes, sure. So you hear a lot of talk about whether we should have term limits for Congress. Right now, they don't. They can be elected for as long as they're alive and as long as they keep running for election. And if they're elected, then they make it to office. For most states, that it's the same case too, where they don't have. Or I'm sorry, for state executives, most of them do have term limits, but these term limits can look completely different. Sometimes you have consecutive ones where you can only serve for, say, 2 terms / 8 years in office, or you can, and some term lengths for some state executives are going to be different. Most governors have 4-year terms, but for example, Phil Scott in Vermont, he only gets 2-year terms, and I think there's a couple of other governors that do the same thing. But the actual term limits are also different from state to state. So consecutive, you might have 8 years consecutive, or you might have a 16 years lifetime. So the difference between that is you run for 8 years. If you're out for a term, you can theoretically run again. You almost never see that, but you can do that. Whereas lifetime, as soon as you hit the limit, boom, you're done. You can't serve in that office again. There might be another office in government that you can serve in, but that particular one you can't serve in again. And also, before we move on to the legislative branch, I do also want to note that, generally speaking, you'll see the same, or I should say, similar requirements to be governor or state executive across states. They're pretty much almost always going to say you have to have lived in the state for a certain amount of years. Some of them will say that you have to be a registered voter for a certain length of time. A lot of times they'll say you have to be a certain age, but that's not always the case. Kansas, for example, they have no specific requirements to be governor. I don't know if any of you saw on the news, but just this last cycle, they had a couple of 2 or 3 18-year-olds who threw their hat in the ring, and they could do that in Kansas. You can't do that in most other states, but in Kansas, you can. I guess theoretically you can run as like a 14, 15-year-old. So it just always differs from state to state, as you'll hear a lot of times in this presentation. But generally, a lot of times you'll see it similar to a U.S. president, where they have to be in the state for a certain amount of years. But no governor has to be born in the United States to be governor of that state, whereas for president, you have to have been born in the U.S.
Right, and there's also age levels on the federal government as well. So it's 25 to be a member of the House of Representatives, 30 to be a member of the Senate, and 35 to be president. Just looking over some of the questions before we move over to the legislative branch, is a very good point here, and that is, I joked about governor and wanting to vote for more positions like the attorney general or whatnot in our state, where we just elect the governor and lieutenant governor. But the question or the comment is correct. We have elected that governor, or the voters have elected the governor and lieutenant governor, and basically they're appointing that person. And most places it's confirmed by the legislature, sometimes it's not, but in theory you're voting for the person that's picking for those people rather than directly electing them. All right, so
sorry, one addition to your point, and that's a big debate you see a lot of times, is should this state executive be elected or should they be appointed? And to use my state as an example again, in Florida, up until I think 2002, we used to elect our Secretary of Education. Then I guess it would have been a state constitutional amendment, it became appointed. And a lot of people, for appointments, they argue, well, the governor will be more likely to know the best criteria for electing somebody, and that they won't be beholden to partisan politics, or at least that's the argument. And then others will argue for an elected position where, well, they should be accountable directly to the people. And those aren't the only arguments, but that's the basic idea behind it. So you still see a lot of those debates today, and every so often you'll see changes where an appointed official becomes elected by the people, and once elected positions become appointed.
Yeah, that's always interesting when that happens. When as you say, when there's usually a state constitutional amendment or some other ballot question or whatever that transitions the manner in which a position is selected. I always think those are pretty interesting. All right, so transitioning over to the legislative branch and the differences between that at the federal level and the state level. And as we've talked about, there's a lot of commonalities in terms of the way they function, in terms of their process. They're very similar in that sense. But when you talk about the size of the legislative bodies themselves or the size of the districts they represent, you can get some pretty wide variations. Isn't that true?
Yeah, absolutely. So for state houses, for example, Alaska's got a really small state legislature. Their state house, they only have 40 people, and their state senate, they only have 20 people. You go to New Hampshire, and you get 400 representatives, and I think only like 25 state senators. Minnesota has the most state senators with 67, and that's all just based on whatever the state government thinks is necessary, whatever the statutes dictate their sizes should be, that sort of thing. But yeah, sometimes you'll see very small or crazy high numbers of state legislators depending on where you go.
Yeah, and of course, given the population of a state and the number of people in each chamber, that also translates into some pretty wide disparities in terms of the number of people represented by each state legislator. I'm guessing you see some pretty wide swings. I know California, for example, has some very, very because of their population and the size of their state senate, for example, those state senators I think represent more people than people in a federal congressional district do.
Right. So, for example, you might in North Dakota, because they have a very small population and a pretty small state house, you might have 14,000 people represented, or on average represented by state representatives, whereas in California it's like 930,000 people per state house rep. With U.S. House, it's based on proportionality of the population. However many people live in a state, they get a certain amount of state representatives. And with the census underway, you're going to see some shifts, and some states will get more, some states will get less. State houses, it can be sometimes based on that, but it's just they all have their own different ways of doing it. And likewise with state senate, you might have about 3,000 people per legislator like New Hampshire versus 465,000 for California. Every state is just different in that regard.
Exactly. And a couple of other interesting things, if you could talk about a little bit, Paul, is one is some states, and again, New Jersey is one of them, and I know there's a handful, use what they call multi-member districts. And then the concept you were talking about before about term limits also applies, or I'm sorry, term lengths also applies not in a consistent manner across all states. Is that true?
Right. So with multi-member districts, it's very rare, but you do see them occasionally. Like Dave said, New Jersey does it. Maryland's another one. Where it's just as it sounds. The district will get actually multiple people to represent it. Maryland State House has 3 members per district. New Hampshire, again, can have sometimes some of them have 1 representative, but there is at least one other district that has like 11 state representatives, and only about 10 states use it for their houses, and then 2 of those states use it for their state senates. And obviously we have it on the website, the list of which ones use multi-member districts, but it's not very common, but you do see it. Whereas for the U.S. House, it's always single-member districts, although some people have talked about whether they should be multi-member or single-member districts. And as for the variations in the length of terms, state houses, you'll almost always see them get 2-year terms, just like U.S. House. But a few times you see 4-year terms, and Maryland is another one of those. Both their state Senate and their state House have 4-year terms. State Senates are a bit different, where most will have 4-year terms, but you do see 2-year terms. But a more odd or somewhat odd one that you might see is what's called a 2-4-4 system. And what that means is at the beginning of a decade, the first term of that decade is a 2-year term, but then the next 2 are 4-year terms. And then to make things more complicated is some states don't necessarily use the same 2-4-4 system. So they might use it where it's staggered, where after a census, one half of state senators get a 2-year term, and then the other half just get the normal size ones. And in other cases, it is just every single senator serves 2-year terms and then successive 4-year terms. I think Minnesota is one of those, or one of the states up there. It might be Montana I'm thinking of. But also most states don't have term limits on their legislators. Like we were talking about with state executives, they actually generally do have term limits on their legislators. But for most states, you don't see it. We have 15 states that use them, and a few other states that used to have term limits, but their state Supreme Courts struck them down as unconstitutional according to their specific state constitutions. So it's another example of states just handling things differently based on, their own state laws, whereas you won't see that kind of thing happen in even a state like right next door.
All right, that's great to just capture how there's just so much variability among the states. Where we have this certain expectation as to how things operate at the federal level, and like I said, it operates similarly at the state level, but there's just in the details there's just a lot of differences. We wanted to highlight the Nebraska exception, and Nebraska is a really unique state legislature. So, Paul, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the 2 ways that Nebraska is different from pretty much all the rest.
So the first way that they're different is they're like how we talked about every other state house and the U.S. House. They're bicamerals. That means they have 2 chambers. They have a state house and they have a state Senate, just like how in Congress we have a U.S. House and a U.S. Senate. With Nebraska, on the other hand, they have what's unicameral, so it's only 1 chamber, and in this case, it's a state Senate. And the second big difference is legislators are, they're nonpartisan. When you're going to vote, they don't have a party label next to them. But in reality, they do tend to lean one side or the other. Just for nominal purposes, they don't actually have a party. And they did this back in 1934, so they've done it for quite a while. But before then, they were just like every other state where they did bicameral, and they were all labeled different partisan, given different partisan labels.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I always knew that they were separate and they did things differently, but I didn't realize how recently that had happened. So I actually learned something here today. I thought it's something that they had for quite a long time, but it's less than 100 years old. All right. Before we get to the, and we've had a lot of great questions, a lot of great discussion here, but we want to make sure we get to the judicial government. But redistricting, which is going to be a very hot topic with the census in process right now, is also handled differently from state to state. Can you just give us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So usually when you hear of state legislatures at a time like this, it's because, just like Dave touched on, it's about redistricting. Most state legislatures, they directly draw district lines. And that's for both state legislative and congressional district lines. Now, if they're states that only have one U.S. House representative, such as Wyoming, then there's no district lines to draw. And for U.S. Senate, they don't have district lines because it's just 2 to each state no matter what. But for state House and state Senate, a lot of them get to draw up how they want to have the lines drawn up. And then that's why every so often you'll see these cases about gerrymandering, where are they giving an unfair advantage to their party in terms of how they drew the districts up. And there are more progressively craftier ways to try to gerrymander, but the technology to detect gerrymandering is also getting better as well. So you'll sometimes see that every so often. But there are a few states that use independent commissions to draw districts. So they're just people that are appointed apart from the state legislature, or you might have it where it's a technically independent commission, but the state legislatures still appoint those committees. Or they might have some mixture of the two. They might use one method for state legislative districts, but they use a different one for congressional districts. And it's also an interesting wrinkle, because generally speaking, state legislatures don't have any significant powers, particularly over the makeup of Congress. But in this case, they get to draw up the congressional districts, which is a pretty unique thing.
Yeah, that's and as I said, that's going to be something that will get talked about a lot with the census going on, and then once that census data is provided to the states, and they can go through this process. And as you say, it will happen in a variety of different ways. All right, let's segue a little bit to the judicial branch and make sure we kind of highlight the differences there, because I think this is to me what's all of these differences is what's really fascinating.
Sorry, real quick, Dave, just because these are quick questions, if we could just get to them real quick. So Francis, you asked about multi-member district elections being jungle elections. No, I'm not. I can't remember for certain if any of them are, but I can tell you at least, for example, in Maryland, they have what's called a top 3 primary. So they'll have the top 3 Republicans and the top 3 Democrats, and then if there's another party running top 3 there, they move on to the general election. When you're talking about jungle elections, also known as blanket primaries, that's something like in Louisiana, where everybody runs on for the office, and if somebody gets over 50%, they automatically win the seat. I don't think any. Yeah. Well, California is a little bit different, where they have what's called a top 2 primary, which is functionally the same, except for the fact that even if you get over 50%, you have to go to a runoff. So you can get in a top 2 primary, like in California, you can get 99% of the vote in the first round. Doesn't matter. You got to go to a runoff. Whereas in the blanket primary, if you do get a majority, like in Louisiana, you just win the office outright. For multi-member districts, I can't remember for certain, but I don't think any of them use jungle primaries, just because of the amount of offices that are there. But I may be wrong. Don't quote me on that. I would have to check up on that. And Randall asked, why did New York move to senators elected every 2 years? I honestly couldn't tell you, because it's whatever New York's reasoning is for it. That's their reasoning. So I can't say for sure why they did it. I guess they just felt that was the right thing to do. It's always, states have their own different reasons. And for Peter, yes, federal, just for the purposes of this, federal, we're talking about the national government. I understand it is a lot confusing, but usually people just use those terms interchangeably. And the redistricting will not be done before November. No.
Yeah, that data I think will be provided sometime in 2021, I believe, to the states. And of course, at Ballotpedia, we'll be tracking that very intently when that occurs, because there'll be basically all 50 states will be going through this process. It'll be a pretty exciting time actually for us. All right, so looking a little bit at the judicial branch, we tend to look at in a lot of cases, there's a lot of federal branches, federal judges, like on the Supreme Court, and also on the other courts as well, where the judges are appointed for life, for as long as they want to serve. But state level judges aren't that way, and there's also a lot of different ways of selecting those judges. Can you kind of name what those are, Paul?
Yeah, so like Dave touched on, you have federal judges, like especially the U.S. Supreme Court. You'll see them get life terms, and sometimes you'll see debates about whether that should be the case. But they've had life terms since the conception of the Constitution. On the other hand, most state level judges will have fixed terms. So you might see 6, 8, 10, 12-year terms. But you also might get unusual ones. For one of Oklahoma's Supreme Courts, they have a 1-year term. And then if they're retained, they get 6-year terms. Some just go until there is a mandatory retirement age, which we'll get to in a moment. But you'll almost never see life terms for state-level judges, except for Rhode Island's Supreme Court. They do let them stay for life terms.
All right, and as we say, there's a bunch of different ways that states can select judges, whether it's by elections where you actually the judge specifies which party they're affiliated with. There's also nonpartisan elections where there's no party listed. In some states they're actually elected by the legislature. Some states they're actually appointed by the governor. And then there's also kind of like a hybrid. There's where the governor makes an appointment, but there's another body that provides recommendations. And I would imagine, Paul, those methods are kind of like sometimes they vary within the state. Like some levels of the court are one way, and others in that same state, other courts are a completely different method, and they're just kind of scattered all across the country.
Yeah. Trial courts, for example, which are below appellate courts, you'll see a lot of them use partisan or nonpartisan elections, whereas that's relatively uncommon for the state appellate or the state Supreme Court. You'll more often see nominating commissions that send a list of potential judges to the governor, and then the governor has to pick from them.
Yeah, and that's there's also different ways on which those nominating commissions are even selected. In some states it has to, the commission has to be composed of a certain way. So each state is very, very different at times in how that is done. And so you have to be familiar with that in the state in which you're living. And then you touched on before that some states have an age by which a judge can no longer serve. Is that right?
Yeah, you'll usually see 70 years old as the mandatory retirement age. A lot of times you also see 75, but each state has their own mandatory retirement age. Some of them don't do it. It's a fair amount of them that don't do it, but you'll usually see as soon as they hit. It's not that they, as soon as they hit the age, that's it, you got to get out right now, but they can serve through the end of that term.
Yeah. And then even such things as the number of members of the court varies from state to state. Obviously, we're used to the federal U.S. Supreme Court has 9 justices. And then some of the other appellate courts have varying sizes. But from state to state, size of their Supreme Courts vary, and also the sizes of their other courts vary too, right?
Right. So Supreme Court benches, they'll always have either 5, 7, or 9. That's so that they don't have a tied opinion on a case. Although there has been even numbers of justices in the past on state Supreme Courts, and even for the U.S. Supreme Court, it's been a long time, at least for the Nationals the national Supreme Court, just to make it a bit more clear which one I'm talking about. But that's why they do the odd numbers. And some appellate courts, or I should say, all the appellate courts just have way different numbers than you'll see elsewhere. And sometimes they're broken up into specific circuits or districts. Florida, I think, has got 4 or 5. California's got, I want to say, 7. Louisiana's got multiple. Some states are small enough that they'll just have one, but it just depends on the size of the state, both in land area and in population.
And just to finish up this topic, we've made reference to the fact that in some states there are 2 state Supreme Courts, and ironically, they're states that are joining each other, Texas and Oklahoma. Do you happen to know what the differences are between those the 2 state Supreme Courts in those states, Paul?
So one does what's called criminal law, and then one does what's civil law. Civil law is usually just a dispute between 2 parties for, they want to be awarded, whatever money for some sort of wrongdoing. But criminal activity usually involves some sort of specific, I try to think of how to best explain it, but some sort of like specific harm. Obviously you have violent crime, but it could also be something like robbery or larceny, that sort of thing. Civil is usually a bit tamer, I guess, in comparison, and it might be more of a murkier dispute as to who's right in that specific scenario.
Lawsuits.
And then to answer the one question that we had, the one last question we had, which was about a court of first instance, that usually means the initial trial court that that a case is heard in. So, in at the state level, it could be a very, very local court. At the federal level, it's always the federal district court, and then it goes up through the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court if necessary. But court of first instance usually refers to that court that is the one that hears, hears the case on a trial level. Sarah, I am afraid I think we're very, very close to time. Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct. But I did want to go ahead and thank everybody for joining, and thanks especially to Paul and Dave. As I mentioned before, we will make this recording available on YouTube. We also have 2 other lectures coming up. The next one is on April 23, which is Introduction to Campaign Finance Law. And the last one is on April 30th on how states select their Supreme Court justices. So I encourage you to sign up for those if you haven't already. And if you think of any additional questions about this lecture, you can send those to editor@ballotpedia.org. Thanks again, everyone, and stay well.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's always nice to see everybody super interested in this kind of stuff. So thank you again for coming to the talk.
Yep. Thank you for joining us.